Masculinities, Identity, Inequality, Continuity, and Change, a comprehensive and contemporary reader for the growing field of men's and masculinity studies. In addition, Tristan is the co-editor of Men and Masculinities, a leading academic journal publishing feminist scholarship on masculinities. His research is supported by prestigious awards, including the POW Initiative for the Study of Critical Social Issue Grant and the Critical Issues in America, Educational and Public Programming Grant. In today's talk titled Hybrid Masculinities and Shifts in Enactment and Meanings of Contemporary Masculinities, Tristan will present data from several different empirical projects to discuss how gender and sexual inequalities have the capacity to be simultaneously challenged and reproduced. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tristan Bridges.
Well, thank you for that really warm introduction. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak. This is my first time to Vancouver, and I love it. Thank you for having nice weather. Thanks to Seth for organizing this, and thanks to Christine, the staff member, for helping organize my visit so thoughtfully. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to tell you a bit about a small piece of research and how it relates to some larger projects that I'm engaged in right now. So the piece that I'll present today is a small piece from a mostly ethnographic project that I undertook studying the ways that 3 separate groups of men understand and engage with gender and sexual politics and inequality. And it's part of a larger book project that I'm slowly working on that I'll also discuss. And some other research projects are connected with this too, so you'll hear about those. But today I'm actually going to only talk with you about one of those 3 groups that I studied. And beyond that, I'm actually only going to talk about one practice in which that one group engaged. But I'll be talking about how practices like those that come up in the talk are related to the larger project. And part of this project sort of theorizing transformations in young, straight, cisgender white men's identities today, and how they're connected with enduring systems of gender and sexual inequality. Let's see here. I need to go old school. Oh. There we go. Maybe I'll bring this over here. So this is a small piece of a chapter for a book manuscript I'm at work on that I've sort of tentatively entitled Hybrid Masculinity and Transformations in Gender and Inequality Among Men. The larger study consists of these 3 groups of separate groups of men that I ethnographically studied over the course of 2 years, in addition to some other research. I was interested in examining the ways that different groups of men understand gender and sexual inequalities and make sense of their own gender and sexual identities. I wanted to know more about men with differing gender and sexual politics, but I was also interested in studying groups of men who had sort of differing levels of awareness of gender and sexual inequality and how those kinds of distinctions might shape their identities, their interactions, their relationships, and their everyday lives. But today, I actually just want to talk about one of those 3 groups. And zooming in a little bit farther than that, I'm going to actually just talk about one specific practice in which that one group engaged. Today, I'll tell you about a practice that emerged among this pro-feminist group that I studied, 22 young, cisgender, mostly white, heterosexual men who make up a group that I call Guys for Gender Justice. I'll tell you a little bit more about my data and methods in a bit, and I'll describe the full project in a little bit more at the conclusion of my talk. But let me just start by giving you a sense of the data. So the following is a piece of a small, from a transcript of a small side conversation that emerged at a weekend group meeting among Guys for Gender Justice. The meeting's being held at one member Rory's house in late fall. Rory baked some brownies and cookies for the occasion, and I showed up at his house early to set up his living room. So the coffee table was littered with paper plates, napkins, soda cans, and 18 of the 22 members showed up on this particular day. And they crowded around Rory's coffee table on dining room chairs, couches, stools, side tables, a couple lawn chairs, and Rory has one beanbag. Rory selected the discussion topic. This week, they met to talk about identifying as feminists and men. And we'd all been emailed that topic in advance. So this week, the discussion leader, which was typical, often asked everyone to go around and sort of share a reflection related to the topic as things got started. But this week, we only made it to about 4 men in before the conversation suddenly shifted gears. It became intensely competitive, with men eagerly awaiting to speak next. Someone shared a story of having been mistaken for gay, and the group launched into what I later learned was kind of a ritual among this group. So here's a short piece of an interaction that went on for about 14 minutes. Tony shared, not this Tony, Tony shared, "Oh my God, sometimes I feel like I can't go outside without somebody thinking I'm gay. It's like, I mean, what am I wearing?" And everyone laughs. And then Peter, the youngest member, joins in laughing and says, "Don't get me started. I'm the king of this. You all thought I was gay. I walked in when he was introduced to the group and you were all," and George interrupts him laughing and points at him and says, "We did." Justin interrupts. Justin's a teacher. He says, "I get that at the start of term or with new teachers. New students all think I'm gay. New teachers are like, is Justin gay?" I'm like, number one, get over yourself. And number two, nope, just a nice guy. Bradley interrupts and says, "Last week I came out as straight again to my parents' friends. Whenever I meet a new friend of theirs at their house, I get that look, the like, is he sort of look. I just stand there and I'll be like, I'm like, nope, just smiling, that's all." And the group laughs. This goes on for a lot longer. It's sometimes difficult to hear. It's extremely difficult to transcribe because the men are laughing throughout and they're jumping over each other to talk next. But they're not being shared as a mechanism of sort of evoking shame. They're being lauded over members of the group. So when Bradley finished his story about his parents' friends thinking he was gay with "nope, just smiling, that's all," he actually opened his arms to the side and he kind of had donned this proud smirk like he just delivered a performance in front of an eager crowd. These are stories about gender, sexuality, and status. And it's a ritual in this group that I became intensely familiar with over the year that I studied them. And it's a practice about which I interviewed all the members in the group. And the group isn't alone. Sexual ambiguity sometimes works to some straight men's advantage. In the right context, among just the right audience, it can bolster some men's claims to particular kinds of heterosexual masculinities. So as an example, when James Franco here was crowned Hollywood's gayest straight man by Attitude magazine, part of what I'm suggesting is that that's actually a kind of heterosexual masculine currency, but it's not one that just anyone can cash in on. When asked to sexually identify in interviews at the time, Franco replied, "I'm gay in my art and straight in my life." In some ways, straight men's willingness to identify with that kind of sexual ambiguity is an indication of incredible change, and maybe we ought to be celebrating it. James Franco is celebrating. The Men and Guys for Gender Justice seem to be celebrating, but I was skeptical that that was the only interpretation. And the cultural backdrop against which stories like this are shared is actually one of decreasing sexual prejudice. Surveys of Americans have shown increasing levels of what sexuality scholars sometimes refer to as sexual tolerance in recent years. So gradually, for instance, smaller numbers of Americans claim that they'd be upset to learn that their child identified as gay or lesbian. Same-sex marriage has been a huge issue, and part of the Supreme Court decision in the United States likely had to do with public opinion. And while sociologists who study sexuality often discuss the sort of limits of the quote-unquote born this way discourse, that particular set of ideological beliefs about sexuality is also consistent with progressive politics and support for sexual equality. And a number of survey questions have discovered that fewer than 50% of Americans are now expressing sexual prejudice, at least by those measures. One that made headlines in 2010 is actually the purple line here. And that's that more than 50% of Americans viewed, quote unquote, gay and lesbian relations as, quote unquote, morally acceptable. The change was particularly interesting when Gallup dug into the group primarily responsible for that shift, young men. And this is significant because since we've been asking questions about sexual prejudice on surveys, men have always expressed more of it. This was one of the first ways that scholars actually began to theorize homophobia as an important element of masculinity in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But just in the last decade, men have started to express less sexual prejudice on some measures when compared with women, and young men appear to be leading the charge. This last line that I just put up, the orange line here, indicates the proportion of the American public surveyed by Gallup who feel that we've reached the level of acceptance of sexual minorities with which they are personally satisfied. So it's not a measure of whether we've reached sexual equality or not, but as of 2017, a majority of Americans claim to be satisfied with the level of LG acceptance in the United States. Alongside these other lines that might seem logically contradictory, but actually contradictory opinions are often powerful mechanisms by which systems of inequality get perpetuated. And the gender gap in sexual prejudice actually goes back to the beginnings of social science research on the topic. One social psychologist whose work I've become mildly obsessed with is named Mary Kite. And she dedicated much of her career to documenting the gender of sexual prejudice, as she puts it. Kite has published the best meta-analyses documenting the gender gap in sexual prejudice over time and all around the world. These isn't from her data. These are the most recent World Values Survey data. And here you can see from their very awkwardly worded question that men respond in more sexually prejudiced ways in just about every nation that's measured. I organized them here so that you can see the blue dots men are above the red dots women, but I'm not sharing this to suggest the sort of homonationalist notion that nations farther to the left on the figure may be somehow less sexually prejudiced than nations to the right. Rather, it's just really easy to see that gap between men and women. And I highlighted the US and Canada here so we can appreciate this distinction between our two nations within these data, but also to note that the gap exists in both. It just appears a little larger in the United States. Really interestingly, Mary Kite claims that the gender gap in sexual prejudice has actually increased over time. Most surveys of sexual prejudice in most societies around the world have moved in the same direction as those that I presented on the last slides. It appears that people have become more sexually tolerant, to use Susanna Walter's term, in recent years. But on most of these measures, women's change has actually outpaced men's. So that accounts for decreasing levels of sexual prejudice on most survey measures, but an increasing gender gap in sexual prejudice between women and men more broadly. So although it sounds a little paradoxical, part of what is being suggested here is that although it's become less acceptable and more widely challenged to be sexually prejudiced, it may have also come to have an even stronger relationship with masculinity over that time. And just by way of a brief example, I'll comment on a paper I published with Emma Michel and Monica Cadillo a couple years ago, analyzing Google Trend data. It's the most fun paper I've ever worked on. We were initially provoked to publish this paper by an article that was published in the New York Times Magazine by the economist Seth Stephens-Davidowitz, who made a name for himself when he learned that Google Trend data was something we could look at. He published this piece on parental gender bias by looking at gender gaps in Google searches that started with "is my son" versus Google searches that started "is my daughter." And the analysis made the magazine because he found that parents were more likely to ask Google if their sons were gifted than they were to ask the same question about their daughters. They were also more likely to ask Google if their sons were leaders, a genius, stupid, behind, and other things. And there were searches that skewed feminine also. So most of the appearance-based searches actually skew feminine. So parents Google, is my daughter overweight? Much more commonly than they ask a similar question about their sons. They also ask Google if their daughters are ugly, and they don't ask Google anything near that commonly about sons. Seth Stephens-Davidowitz suggested in the article that the most commonly asked question by parents of Google for either sons or daughters was, "Is my son gifted?" And it's true. People Google that a lot in the United States. Google data are really difficult to work with because there's sort of infinite ways that you can finish a search like that. So you kind of have to think like someone who Googles to examine the data. But Michel Cadillo and I applied for access to the API data from Google because we wanted to dig into something that we thought we'd noticed, that parents seem to ask Google if their sons were gay roughly 20 times more frequently than if they asked Google if their sons were gifted. And they do. And they ask whether their son is gay more commonly than they ask similar questions about their daughters. In fact, this is a graph that's showing you parents' Google searches for "is my son gay" compared to the combined searches of "is my daughter gay," "is my daughter lesbian," or "is my daughter a lesbian?" So there's a gender gap, and we argue that the Google data document this sort of gendered pattern of what we in the article call parental concern over gay sons versus gay daughters. And the gap in gendered concern actually stood up across every gendered Google search that we looked for like this. So people ask Google if their husbands are gay at higher rates than their wives. They ask if their dad's gay more than their mom. They ask about gay boyfriends more than gay girlfriends. They ask about gay brothers more than gay sisters. People even ask if their uncle is gay at higher rates than aunts, and grandpas more than grandmas. And most fun of all, because Google is weird, people also Google the phrase "is he gay" at much higher rates than "is she gay." I'm not sure what you hope to get back from that search, but those are the data. We don't in the article, and we can't argue that this illustrates sexual prejudice or homophobia. Perhaps people are simply looking for resources to support people in their lives. But it does document this pattern of concern is gendered in ways that perhaps illustrate the endurance of the relationship between masculinity and heterosexuality more generally. Since scholars of gender began to recognize masculinity as an important piece of gender relations to study, they've understood homophobia to be an important and constitutive element. So enactments of homophobia have long been understood by sociologists who study masculinity as sort of fundamental component of contemporary masculine identities and as a key element of gender and sexual inequality. Recently, however, scholars of masculinity have been presented with a little bit of a methodological paradox, as Sarah Diefendorf and I characterize it in a recent article we published in Sexualities. And it's a paradox to which the research that I'm presenting today speaks. On the one side, quantitative scholarship, quantitative measures of sexual prejudice have documented that kind of steady decline that I documented on previous figures. And different scholars have kind of accounted for that in different sorts of ways. So, for instance, a variety of research suggests that shifts in attitude towards same-gender sexualities in the United States cites things like secularization, shifts in Americans' ideological beliefs about sexuality, a weakening relationship between AIDS and homosexuality, increasing numbers of out gay men and lesbians, advances in civil liberties, and even American liberalization more broadly. But these data and trends kind of beg the question of whether the relationship between masculinity and homophobia might actually be disappearing or in decline. And then qualitative research, with some exceptions, has generally continued to find, though, that homophobia, sexual prejudice, and anti-gay attitudes remain important elements of men's gender identities and interactions. So scholarship here has continued to be really interested in the way that the diverse ways that men enact sexual prejudice in interaction. Even experimental research in the United States has documented that homophobia continues to be understood as a masculine resource. So when we bring men into labs and we sort of experimentally threaten their masculinity, one response is that men are more likely afterwards to espouse anti-gay and homophobic sentiments. And some scholars who've tried to make sense of this apparent conundrum have tried to do this sort of dance where they ask, well, who's right? Like, which one of these sides is the right measure? But in my view, in the argument I'm forwarding in the book, rarely are answers to these types of social problems as simple as the question implies. And often when we treat them as though they're simple, answerable, we're actually relying on a problematic and historically inaccurate understanding of sexual inequality. As Americans have changed their opinions about sexual inequality, the ways in which sexual inequality is being perpetuated have also been transforming. And the Men and Guys for Gender Justice and these sort of mistaken for gay contests, as I call them, are right in the middle of a dilemma like this. So when I initially encountered mistaken for gay contests, I was interesting because I just think it's an interesting feature of this group. Here's a group of heterosexual men who get together on a weekly basis to talk about gender, sexuality, and inequality. And it felt like just about every chance they got, they were eager to kind of laud these stories over one another of having been mistaken for gay. And from the context of the data that I presented earlier, I hope it's clear that it seems like they're related somehow to social status in the group. But on a larger level, the stories prompted a couple questions to emerge as I tried to make sense of what's going on. One is, if homophobia is still a central element of masculine identities, then what the heck is a group of straight young white men doing by engaging with, from that perspective, what might look like a kind of ritualistic emasculation? And then the second question I wanted to answer was, what kind of work mistaken for gay stories perform for the men and guys for gender justice? That is, what do stories about sexual illegibility accomplish for these men? What does James Franco get for being on Attitude magazine cover for that story? And to make sense of this, in the book, I resurrect and re-theorize this framework for thinking through continuity and change and gender and sexual inequality more critically. I refer to the framework as hybrid masculinities, and along with C.J. Pascoe, we initially theorized this line of scholarship as emerging out of some of Mike Mesner's work in the early 90s, critically dissecting what were then called sort of new man rhetoric, looking at things that were seen as big changes in men's public gender presentations, like political leaders crying in public, for instance, or more involved fathering. I published an article in 2014 in Gender and Society, and then a subsequent article the same year with C.J. Pascoe, where we sort of theorized the framework. And we argue that hybrid masculinities is particularly useful for making sense of transformations in gender and sexual relations, and trying to sort of diagnose what precisely those transformations might mean for contemporary systems of gender and sexual inequality. As a concept, hybrid masculinities refer to all those masculine gender identity projects that involve this kind of assimilation of elements of subordinated and marginalized masculinities, and every once in a while, femininities as well. And the term is starting to catch on among scholars again. Hybrid masculinities, though, has always been of primary interest to masculinity scholars who are concerned with gender, sexuality, inequality, and change. And broadly speaking, existing bodies of scholarship on this have primarily been interested in sort of answering two questions about hybrid masculinities. First, they wanted to know how pervasive these kinds of practices and identity projects actually are. And then second, they're interested in examining the consequences associated with these new iterations of gender performance. And through 2014, the majority of scholarship on these questions had kind of answered the questions in one of two ways. Some scholars suggested that hybrid masculinities were not all that common, not very pervasive, but that they often did have the effect of reproducing inequality. And then a separate stream of scholarship suggested that hybrid masculinities were in fact extremely pervasive, but that they also might be an illustration of some of the realization of gender and sexual equality. In my own research and my review of the research that bears on this topic with C.J. Pascoe suggested that both sides were sort of missing something. I think at this point, we can say that a good deal of scholarship on masculinity from all around the world suggests that hybrid masculinities are indeed widespread features of contemporary gender relations, but their relationship with gender and sexual inequality is just a little bit more complex than previous scholarship had initially suggested. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about my methods and data collection here because this is not a job talk and I want to get back to the findings. But briefly, I'll tell you that I studied this particular group. So I studied the three groups over the course of 2 years, and I studied this group for one of those 2 years. The group's almost entirely white, all but 2 of the 22 members. They all identify as heterosexual. They're extremely educated, although they'd best be classified as downwardly mobile. And so what I mean by that is that they don't have the kinds of job and occupational prestige that you might expect when you find out how much education their parents have and what kind of jobs their parents are in. They ranged in age from 22 to 37, but the majority of the men in this group are in their sort of late 20s, early 30s. And to collect the data for this project, I went to weekly meetings like the one from Rory's that I discussed earlier. Those were hosted in their homes like Rory's, their apartments, and in some cases, the basements of their parents' homes, because that's where they were living. I hung out with them socially. I met their friends and family members. I visited them at work and at home. I also collected data from social media and email interactions. And then finally, some of the data that I'll present come from casual interviews that I conducted with members of the group throughout the course of the study, and from a more formal, semi-structured set of interviews that I conducted with each of the men at the conclusion of the study. The largest pattern that I found in my interview data, and interview is the key word for the graduate students in the room, is actually a pattern that a lot of scholars studying young, straight, cis, white identifying men are finding. And that's that they actually don't think of themselves as all that much like a group that they like to call most men. So it's ironic, right? When I sit down for an interview with men now and they say, I'm not actually like most men, it makes me smile because I think, you know what? The last guy said that too. So quotes like these come up in interviews because this is the context in which these phrases are uttered. They're uttered in one-on-one interactions when men are asked about gender or masculinity. And today, lots of men are starting to talk about how differently they perceive themselves to be from the norm. So this is how Tim, who's that one, who's a 30-year-old nursing student in Guys for Gender Justice, said it when I interviewed him. He told me, I'm different from men in the abstract. I mean, I just don't really have all that much in common with most guys. I don't need to prove that I'm a man or whatever. I just don't really care what people think about me like that. If you think I'm gay or a fag or that I can't talk football or something, he shared, I just don't really give a fuck. I don't have anything to prove. And then he paused and said, I mean, it's not like I'm not masculine or something. I just don't really care about it. And I think that makes me, and then he paused, and then he laughed, and he finished, well, I was going to say it makes me more manly, but you know what I mean. So this is an interesting development because this is actually a really big difference from interview studies conducted with this population 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. We used to get men eager to demonstrate that they were masculine. Men would tout the qualities that they felt situated them as either comfortably masculine or just as masculine as most other guys. But today, this group of men seem eager to kind of categorically distance themselves from masculinity altogether. It's an interesting development, and I review probably more work than I should from scholars all around the world who situate a finding like this as the primary discovery. It's an issue related to the finding I'm talking about today, because mistaken for gay narratives are kind of used as a sort of evidence that frames these men's understandings of themselves as distinct from most men to the Guys Guys for Gender Justice. The argument that I'm making here is that mistaken for gay stories work as a kind of hybrid masculine practice. They allow men in the group to borrow symbols from gay culture and stereotypes about gay masculine identities to sort of authenticate the gender identities they're fashioning through their participation in this group. And then the ritual of sharing these stories with one another helps them to collectively situate themselves as good men, feminist men, straight men who not only aren't bothered by having been mistaken for gay, but who actually wear those sort of interactions as badges of honor. The practice also, however, I think plays a role in situating other men as somehow the real problem when it comes to gender and sexual inequality. So while this is a group who discusses institutionalized forms of gender and sexual privilege and inequality, when talking about themselves, they often revert to this discourse of good guys and bad guys that always seems to kind of put themselves, comfortably situate themselves as sort of beyond reproach. And claiming ownership of elements of gay culture was one way that men and Guys for Gender Justice sort of collectively situated themselves as different from most men in a positive way. So for instance, in one group meeting during which the topic of the week was a consideration of how to respond to toxic masculinities, and one member of the group spoke up early in the meeting. Saul's 28. He works in a retail clothing store and he fancies himself very fashionable. To be fair, I also fancy Saul fashionable. He has this sort of mop of dusty blonde hair that he's always like tossing out of his eyes. It's a type. He wears thick rectangular black plastic frame glasses like I do, and he's slender and he wears tight fitting clothes. And Saul shared, if I'm with a group of feminists and I can tell I'm getting a sketchy vibe from some guy, like if he's questioning my sexuality, Saul said to the group, I'll gay it up to show support. Why should I give a care if he's wrong about my sexuality? Later, Saul's explaining to the group how sometimes it can be difficult to identify himself as a feminist in public, as meaningfully different from other men. With his elbows on his knees on the edge of his seat, he shared with the group, we're not like most guys. We're the good guys. But a lot of times, good guys look just like bad guys. The other men in the group are sort of nodding solemnly along while Saul shared this. And establishing themselves as a good guy is not actually a concern that's limited to feminist men. Masculinity to many of the men that I studied in all three groups was something that they understood as potentially stigmatizing, an identity that might mean that they're seen by others as perhaps receiving sort of more than their fair share. But among Guys for Gender Justice, establishing oneself as a credible feminist was something about which these men were sort of deeply concerned. A separate group meeting, the weekly topic was identifying as a feminist man. And Todd opened up during this meeting about feeling distrustful of other men who identified as feminist. And here he makes this conflation between sexual illegibility and feminism in men explicit when he shared, when I hear a guy say he's feminist, I'm totally proud of him. But part of me is also thinking, really? And like if guys are all thinking it's cool to say that, that's progress. But how do you know? You can't really figure out how committed people are. Most guys aren't part of a group like Guys for Gender Justice he's talking about. And if people think you're gay, like that's not automatically like, oh, you're not gay? You must be a feminist. And I mean, I'm fine with that. I'm happy to be thought of as gay, he said. I love gay guys, and I think feminists think that's a cool thing. Establishing themselves as kind of on the right side of gender and sexual political debates was something that was deeply troubling to these men. And although they may have gone to greater lengths in search of that credibility than others, their struggle, I think, is one that many young straight cis white men are navigating today. Consider this relatively recent case of George Lawler. This photo of George went viral a few years ago when he shared it alongside a post he wrote for his university's student news blog entitled, Why I Don't Need Consent Lessons. For some, it prompted similar posts across all manner of social media, but it also drew a good deal of negative attention. George, too, seemed to feel unfairly stigmatized by other men, and he was eager to distance himself from these kind of toxic stereotypes of masculinity. In some ways, I think George is struggling with a dilemma many young cisgender straight identifying men are struggling with today: how to navigate the increasing visibility of intersectional forms of privilege and inequality. Mistaken for gay narratives are one solution that actually might not look all that different from George's once we begin to understand how, why, and where these discourses are mobilized by these men. One of the most common sources of collective anxiety for the men in this study was recognition as feminist men. They often confessed when they brought this up that they weren't after what they called extra credit for doing what they felt everyone should do. And they talked about feeling overappreciated as feminists and men sometimes, but they simultaneously talked about feeling under-recognized. So overappreciated on the one hand and under-recognized on the other. It sounds like a logical contradiction, but here's how Rob explained it. He wrote, part of being pro-feminist is recognizing that you get a lot of recognition and no recognition at all. A man talking about sexual violence as real? Shit, it must be real. That man said it. That's recognition, he said, but that's really just superficial. On a deeper level, like when I come out as feminist with people, women especially, their first thing is to kind of question that or be like, no, you're not. Feminists are women. Acknowledging overappreciation as symptomatic of gender inequality is something that came up throughout my research and something I published on. But under recognition was actually a much more common topic of conversation among this group. How to be publicly recognized as feminist, as on the right side, and what that recognition might actually entail was symptomatic of, I think, their collective anxieties about what embodying feminist masculinities might actually look like. So a common topic of conversation concerned their attempts to avoid the stigma they felt when they were grouped in with most men. The men found the feminist masculinity that they attempted to kind of forge collectively in their group meetings here difficult to perform in their daily lives in ways that distinguished themselves from most men that could be recognized by others. And men relied on stories about their embodiments of gay masculinities as one method of laying claim to an authentically feminist identity. For instance, one member of the group, Shane, shared, "People sometimes think I'm gay. They just think I might be or something. But I take it as an opportunity to help gay people. I'll usually say something like, because I'm stylish, or because I'm nice to people. What, because I'm healthy and I care about my clothes and the way I look? You know, oh, because I have good taste in music? I don't know why," Shane told me, but clearly I'm confusing people. Shane's doing a couple of things there. He's clearly challenging the boundaries of heterosexual masculinity, but on another level, Shane is also policing those same boundaries, or sort of what qualifies as counting as gay or straight in the first place. So rather than asking whether straight men's adoption of elements associated with gay men's culture is either challenging or reproducing gender and sexual inequality, part of what I'm suggesting here is that we need to consider the ways that sometimes it's both challenging and reproducing gender and sexual inequality. Shane believes, or he wants others in the group to believe, that his embodiment of masculinity caused people to question his true sexuality. And he's not alone in attempting to identify with that sexual illegibility as a kind of masculine resource. Indeed, most commonly, the Men and Guys for Gender Justice shared stories of having been mistaken for gay that allowed them to implicitly claim to be publicly recognized as different from most men in a positive way. In A Queer Time and Place, Jack Halberstam coins the phrase transgressive exceptionalism. Halberstam suggests in the book that in mainstream gay, lesbian, and trans communities, the real battles are about what group and which individuals within that group occupy the most culturally aggrieved position. Who, in other words, is the most transgressive? As Halberstam writes, quote, "In this context, transgressive exceptionalism refers to the practice of taking the moral high ground by claiming to be more oppressed and thus more extraordinary than others." Academics have sort of mostly, although not entirely, turned away from this kind of contest of oppressions. But here Halberstam suggests that these kinds of questions loom large in more popular debate. Mistaken for gay narratives work, I think, in a strikingly similar fashion as claims to transgressive exceptionalism. These stories get jokingly lorded by these men over the generic category of most men in ways that enabled themselves to sort of situate themselves as perhaps having more in common with oppressed than oppressor. And while the discourse is more, that particular discourse is actually more commonly associated with anti-feminist groups like the men's rights movement, but I think you can identify a softer and potentially less easily identifiable version of that discourse here as well. Mistaken for gay narratives are relied on as evidence of these men's transgressions from normative models of masculinity, evidence that they attempt to mobilize as proof of their political convictions and authenticity. The stories are shared as a way of claiming not to care about sexual misrecognition, but clearly, and I hope you can see this from the data presented, these men cared passionately. Indeed, they're shared as they're bragging. They're shared as stories of success, they're not feeling shame. It was common, for instance, in the way that they talked about being mistaken for gay, to jokingly correct the mistake, distinguishing themselves from most men more explicitly by offering ways of more clearly potentially embodying heterosexual masculinity. So for instance, Ben is a school counselor in the group, and he discusses being mistaken for gay by students. He shared, "Students ask me that. I always think I just imagine what if I was gay? That would be totally inappropriate." And I tell them that. But then it's why? The students, they tell me it's because I'm really helpful and that I seem to really care about where they end up. I mean, I get stuff about looking gay too. Or one student said, because I didn't have a picture of my wife up in my office, she just assumed. Apparently my office isn't hetero enough, he shared. Maybe I'll put a car engine in there or like hang some porn on my wall. Ben's joking, but Ben's joke here allows him to claim recognition as a feminist man and to distance himself from stereotypes of masculinity associated with misogyny. Many of the men in the group relied on stereotypes of working class masculinities, like Ben did, to accomplish this, but they also used non-white masculinities sometimes, and occasionally they used politically conservative masculinities as a foil too. So, for instance, another member discussed being mistaken for gay this way, who works at a bank. He said, "I mean, I'm not gay because I wear a tie to work. In fact, he once told me that he has to wear a tie to work, but I went to his work. It is optional," which is fine. I'm not gay because I wear a tie to work or because I'm afraid to wear a little color in my outfits. It's like, that's me being professional. I have to dress up. It's part of my job. And part of me is like, I mean, it's not my fault if I look cute and mauve, right? He's laughing, and so is everyone else, because right there when he said that, he pursed his lips just slightly. It's not my fault. Would it make you more comfortable if I looked like some oppressive Bible salesman, like telling women to get back in the kitchen? And then he said, not all, I mean, all that glitters isn't gay, right? And everyone in the group explodes in laughter. These men are clearly a far cry from the stereotypes that they sort of mockingly deploy here, but it's actually precisely through displaying distaste for such masculinities that I'm arguing that the men in this group are actually doing masculinity. In 1994, in a chapter Pierrette Houndagnusatello and Mike Mesner published in the anthology Theorizing Masculinity, they wrote, "Too often, critical discussions of masculinity tend to project atavistic, hypermasculine, aggressive, misogynistic masculinity onto relatively powerless groups of men. By comparison, the masculine gender displays of educated, privileged new men are too often uncritically applauded rather than skeptically and critically examined." This is a larger finding consistent with most of the work addressing what I'm calling hybrid masculinities. Clearly, this sort of new man rhetoric is about more than just challenging inequality. One reading of these men's use of mistaken for gay narratives is that they are just sort of less easily offended by the idea that their embodiment of masculinity is read as gay than maybe previous generations of heterosexual identifying men might have been. But it's actually that very disinterest that the Men and Guys for Gender Justice mobilize as a kind of masculine resource. By claiming to naturally embody gay aesthetics through mistaken for gay stories, these men represent some of the shifting landscape of gender and sexual relations and inequality today. But the potential embedded in these embodiments of illegible masculinities went, I found, largely unrealized. And I'll tell you why. Over the course of the year that I studied these men, mistaken for gay stories and contests like this came up a lot. But I never heard anyone share a story of having been mistaken for gay that was anything other than good, clean fun. It was an honest mistake on the part of someone or some collection of someones. So no one shared stories of being mistaken for gay and having been subject to sexual prejudice, homophobia, or bullying, for instance. I never heard anyone share a story of having been mistaken for gay and having had genuine cause for their safety. And when I interviewed men about this practice at the end of my year studying them, no one claimed to have withheld stories like that from me. In fact, the most common response was similar to Tim's reaction when I asked him the question. Most men were surprised. Tim said, "I never thought I might be in danger for people thinking I was gay or something like that." And I can't say no one in the group has had that, or like something bad happened because someone thought they were gay or something. But I haven't heard anyone share something like that. And then he paused and continued. And I will say this, that's the kind of thing someone would share. I mean, that's what we talk about. So this is not to say that sexual illegibility is never associated with danger or harm. What I found is that these men never perceived themselves to be in danger of harm. And it speaks to the meanings of straight men's use of and participation in gay culture more broadly, I think. For these men, being sexually illegible seemed to help but never hurt. As Raewyn Connell famously wrote, gender arrangements are at the same time sources of pleasure, recognition, and identity, and sources of injustice and harm. And this means that gender is political, Connell writes, but it also means that politics can be complicated and difficult. Connell suggests here that gender and sexual inequality are often difficult to recognize precisely because they're simultaneously sources of both pleasure and pain. By relying on mistaken for gay narratives, however, these men capitalize on some of the pleasures associated with transgressing normative gender and sexual boundaries, but avoid much of the injustice and pain. The larger book project examines the ways that gender, racial, and sexual privilege have ceased to be invisible to those benefiting from them in ways that each of these types of privilege were sort of initially theorized inside of sociology. So that metaphor of invisibility that we've long used to explain privilege to undergraduate students is simply less apt today than it was 40 years ago. We used to argue that privilege is less visible than inequality and that it's least visible to those who have the most of it. But I think this has shifted. These men know about Peggy McIntosh's invisible knapsack. They run workshops helping boys and men in elementary schools through college think about these dynamics. They do it in workplaces too. They're aware. And while men identifying as feminists are still maybe less common than we would like, I've studied men in a variety of different contexts and settings with radically different gender politics. And among the commonalities, as I've learned, is that all of them understand the language and discourse of privilege. It's visible to them, even if they disagree with it. So moving forward, I think we're actually at an important juncture in studying intersectional forms of structured advantage and privilege. We can start to ask how systems of inequality are challenged and reproduced under new historical and cultural circumstances. And I'm far from alone in this endeavor, but this little piece of work is one contribution to the kind of larger bodies of work on this topic, examining what precisely happens to systems of inequality when they're put under the historical spotlight. In other words, what happens to privilege when we make it sweat? And here, my research is consistent with what others are finding, showing that visibility alone does not actually undo privilege. But it often does mean that inequalities have to be perpetuated in novel ways. Thanks so much. I really appreciate this time being able to share some of my work. I'm looking forward to talking about it with you.
It's on. Okay. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I had so many thoughts. And anyway, it was really enjoyable to hear about your research and your findings. So there was a kind of question that was nagging me as you were doing your presentation. And I was kind of thinking, like, how would you present your findings to this group of men, right? Like if you were to give them feedback from your research. And one of the reasons I'm thinking about that is that I have two sons who are, I don't know what they're going to be sexuality wise, but they're white and middle class. And my partner and I sometimes have these debates over, like, he's like, don't rant too much about gender stuff. Like, he's like, I don't want my kids to think that they're bad people just because of like who they are, who they were born to be, right? And so I feel like we struggle this. I mean, it's a struggle when you have boys, of like how to raise them as conscious of their own privilege. And anyway, so that's like a personal question from my perspective. But I was also thinking, like, what would you say to these guys who are, yeah, like I don't know. Maybe I'll just stop there. I think it's
Sure.
I'm like, how would you tell them, like, this is what I've learned about you, and what might they do differently?
So I share work with them for anyone who's interested in reading. And the reaction to some of the early work with criticisms was that many felt misrepresented. When my first article came out, they felt like that's not what we're doing. And so we chatted about it. And one thing that I've learned is that in feminist spaces, we celebrate men for anything. In 2010, I did a study on a series of Walk a Mile in Her Shoes marches in the United States, which are these, if you're not familiar, they're done internationally, even in places where women don't wear high heels, where men literally walk 1 mile to raise awareness and sometimes support and money for gender and sexual violence and inequality. And they wear high-heeled shoes, and they walk for 1 mile to walk in her shoes. And I found, I mean, the marches are, if you've never been to one, they're ridiculous. In fact, my research was used, like the most consequential thing that's ever come out of my research was used to challenge these marches in both Virginia and Ohio. I found that men show up and they make jokes. There's a lot of humor. There's a lot of performances of gay masculinities. There's lots of misogyny. And it's largely women who make up the audience, and everyone's applauding because men are there. They're right. They've showed up. Most of the marches that I went to are set up by women. And so women get there beforehand. They do some of the speaking before they like let men steal the show. I watched a woman get a bunch of signs out of her car that said things like "Stop the violence" with pictures of high heels on them and stuff. And I went to help out before one. And I said, "What are these?" And she was like, it makes it look like a protest. And I was like, it does. It looks like one. And I think men are used to entering feminist spaces with experiences like that, being applauded, sometimes overthanked for just showing up. And so they're uncomfortable with criticism. But there's this great concept that the sociologist Amy Levesque came up with, who's at the University of Denver, where she says sometimes people are after the privilege of immunity from critique. And I think there's a danger in giving that privilege to groups who are trying to join social movements and work that benefit from the systems of inequality that they're organizing to oppose. I always say, if you're in this, then you should be able to listen to someone tell you how to do it better, or that there might be consequences of your actions that you're not completely aware of. So it's uncomfortable, but if you're doing feminist work and you're not comfortable being uncomfortable, you might not be doing feminist work. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I wanted to know a little more about if they talked about their self-identified heterosexual men, how they were perceived by women. So partners in their life who were saying they didn't have this negative reaction of being perceived as homosexual. But you would think that because they are self-identified heterosexual, they want to be perceived in some way in a masculine way. So I'm sure this came up in a year of conversation. What was their take on, were they ever offended by, let's say, they were trying to date a woman who didn't find them to be, adhering to a certain, like, how did that work for them? Because they're not offended if a friend's parent says like, "Oh, is your friend gay? We don't know. We're kind of giving them a look." But yeah, how are they perceived in their romantic relationships?
They're sort of, part of what you're asking, I think, is kind of how heterosexually successful are they?
Or like, are they offended if they're misperceived in that context? Versus like, if you're at work and someone thinks you're gay, it's different from if you're trying to find a partner and you're perceived as gay, you might be more offended by that.
Yeah. So collectively, they're pretty heterosexually unsuccessful. Some of them date sometimes, and they talked about things a lot. Like it was they would talk about pornography use in similar ways to like evangelical groups of men who are trying to abstain. They talked about, can you have heterosexual sex and be a feminist as a man, was like a topic of conversation. Yeah. And they're uncomfortable with that. But I also, I learned from some of them that I was like, but how often are you actually entering this particular dilemma? And for a lot of them, it's less often than they would hope. So I didn't get any stories about darn, I was trying to date this woman and turns out she too thought I was gay. And in fact, from the context of the way that you heard that discourse motivated, it would have been a weird way of sharing it, right? Because mistaken for gay stories were usually used to brag, and that would have been like a real downer if everyone was going around the circle kind of sharing a story in that way, and you were like, yeah, me too, guys. And you had a story that took on a really different tone. So yeah, I think the larger story, I think, is actually consistent with a lot of work on feminist men, that it's not that surprising, I think, that they're downwardly mobile. In fact, lots of men doing feminist work were sort of like unsuccessful in some ways, in some sort of traditional avenues of masculinity. I think it's why speakers who talk about masculinity that become like really popular, like folks like Jackson Katz, I think they feel like unicorns because we're like, wow, you were masculine in the first place. Like that many people kind of find these communities because they already felt like they weren't very good at doing masculinity. Yeah, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I'm sort of figuring out how much of the sort of sex data is actually going to go in the book, but it was something that came up. Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks.
Well, I can come up. I can tell no. Yeah, I had a similar question. You mentioned like Ben was married, the school counselor, and so like was he the only single person, or sorry, married person, and everyone else was single?
Yeah, so Ben's not married, but he shared that a student said because he didn't have a photo of his wife, the student thought Ben might be married, but Ben was not in fact married.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I guess my actual question is, which is also related to the biggest question, but did you interact with these men outside of feminist group, and were the mistaken for gay, were those ever used as badges of honor in other contexts? Were they ever brought up like outside of the feminist group? I was just thinking about your last implication about what this context can tell us about like the trends over time and gender relations. It just seems like such a particular context. And so I'm just curious about outside of this context, what those were like.
So the only times that it came up outside of this context were either when I interviewed them about it or when they were together and we did something outside of it. So some of the data may have been like, you know, a group of 3 of us were hanging out outside of a group meeting or something. I never saw it come up though, just in their everyday lives. No one did it at work, right? Like no one was like, unbelievable, again with you every time I show up in this outfit. And that to me tells me that like, you know, if we just sort of switch the context and think about it related to another system of inequality, I feel like no one struggles thinking about the behavior as problematic. I remember when I first started talking about this research, people were like, but isn't this a good thing? And a scholar in the audience at one point was like, I mean, imagine a group of white people who talked about being misrecognized as another race in a similar way. And I think we'd really have an easy time being like, this makes me uncomfortable. If something's different here, I don't know why, but it is, I do think like, I don't know, in some ways, like it's very different content, but it feels like meat and potatoes locker room talk to me. Like the sort of jockeying for position, like what they're actually doing is like a masculinity contest culture. It's just a contest about something that we didn't know heterosexual men were in contest over. Thank you, Seth.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. I have so many questions, but I think I'm going to pick one. And I think, so I was interested, something that bugged me is, I think the way you talked about them being perceived as gay, like the way they talked about it sound like completely divorced from the experiences of actual gay people. I mean, you talked about them not feeling threatened, like not feeling like physically threatened, I guess, to be perceived as gay, but also like their perception of what it means to be gay sounds like very much like a pop culture, Will and Grace kind of like attitude toward gay people. And I wonder, first of all, what you think about that, but also if they ever talked about their, like the experiences of actual gay people in any meaningful way.
So yes, I agree with you. I think some of the discomfort comes from the stereotypes that they're deploying and where those stereotypes come from. I mean, this was a group that like their primary mission is sort of feminism to help women, is like why they have organized. Many of them do not have a lot of contact with people who are not heterosexual, or if they do, it's women and part of other feminist groups that they're affiliated with. And it's part of what makes this uncomfortable, I think. And you're right. I mean, I think that I don't know what else to say to it. I agree with you. It's something that I think they're uncomfortable with. They would say, but isn't it a good thing that I don't mind? And I'm like, that would be a good thing. How you're not minding is interesting. Like, I just think it's interesting how you're choosing to display that you don't mind.
Thank you. That was, you're an excellent speaker. That was really compelling. I guess I'm wondering about another interpretation of like an additional one, which would be like, I think I'm somewhat older than you. And something I've observed over time is like when you said, it's not the oppression Olympics anymore. Well, it used to be that it was the problem was men, right? And then the problem became white men. And then the problem became straight white men. And now the problem is cis straight white men. And so, like, I have a demography background, and I can see that the problem is getting smaller and smaller as we add more categories, right?
Yeah.
And so this group of people are smaller and smaller. And of course, like, their entire identity is now a string of 4 problems, right? Like, you add those up, like, what do they have to feel good about? And so isn't claiming, like, I'm mistaken for gay, like partly a way of them kind of going like, you know what, I don't want to be in this category anymore. And like, should we be just like, no, you must be this category and admit your privilege? Like, there's something happening in society to do with this. And this is clearly a left-wing space, because, so to me, this is happening in left-wing spaces, right? And it's not just this group, but like, people are trying to get out of the categories now because the narrative is so clear. And so I'm wondering if that's like an additional kind of understanding of what they're doing.
I think so. I actually have another project that's sort of connected with this, where I'm working with another scholar and we're trying to kind of theorize privilege inside sociology. And we've been reading about how privilege has popped up in all the different subfields. And there are some commonalities. And one of them is this, what I call the relative invisibility of privilege hypothesis, which is this idea that like privilege is really invisible to people who have lots of it. And I think you're right, that's changed. And that has changed like everything about privilege, I think. It means that privilege is not as comfortable as it used to be. So it doesn't necessarily change the fact that you collect it, but it's harder to collect privilege and not be aware that you're collecting it. And I think it changes the valence of identities. So in some ways, like just listening to you talk, I was thinking of Mary Waters' book, Ethnic Options, right? Where like all of a sudden white people started claiming ethnic ancestry in the United States, where they were like, I don't know, just checking white, like, doesn't make me comfortable. So I'm Italian or I'm something, right? And I think something similar is going on where those identities kind of lack something, that it just feels like if you don't have an identity that was forged in movements for equal rights, that your identity takes on this kind of bland feeling. And so I think it's not surprising that people are kind of flirting with this. I mean, this is like, in some ways, you could look at this as like some of the success of the gay liberation movement in the United States has been teaching straight people about gay culture. And like, here's some of what they've learned. And this may not have been what you thought they'd do with it, but this is like an outcome. I think it could potentially be a good thing, but it is not a good thing, I think, in the way that it's currently being used. So there's this great concept that never gets used in the way it should be inside Raewyn Connell's theory that she calls gender vertigo. And it gets misused because Barbara Risman published another book where she also used the concept, but in a slightly different way. And Raewyn Connell sort of suggested that gender relations and inequality can go through these moments that enter stages where when you ask people, what does it mean to be a man or a woman or something else? Like, what does that actually mean? That people kind of shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. And Connell argued that there's enormous political potential inside those moments. But she didn't say it's like the step toward equality. She basically was like, we'll enter these moments where people are uncertain about gender, and we may be able to come out the other side approaching equality, but there might be a backlash, or people might find new ways of accomplishing masculinity. And I think this is some of what's going on, is that there's this moment of vertigo where people are kind of feeling like, I'm uncomfortable with these identities that I have, and I don't know what to do with them. And what they're doing with that discomfort is actually like reinvesting in them, even if they're not thinking of it that way. To think about it in another context, there's like, there's tons and tons and tons of public health campaigns trying to get men to act in ways that are more conducive with public health. We saw them during COVID, but they also are all up over campuses about sexual harassment and assault and things like that, where we try to get men to invest in something good for all of us. We try to masculinize that thing. So there was a campaign that was called "Real Men Can Stop Rape," or "My Strength Is Not for Hurting," for instance. And it depicts these like macho men who are like, I stand up against rape. And you're like, okay, do you have to stand up in such an intimidating fashion? And I know that the reason it's done is because we think it'll invite them in. If we give them masculinity, they'll come. And I feel like it's a false bet. Like, I actually think the road forward politically is about how to help people disinvest and realize that masculinity is just not as meaningful as they think it is. But this is a group that I think is still invested. They're just investing in a really different way than they used to. I don't know if that completely, it's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks. There are so many things that were interesting about this presentation. So I just have a couple of questions. One, I wonder if you could say something about women, how women might experience this. So imagine there's a group, women and them talking about being mischaracterized as gay when they're not gay. How would that go differently? So it seems to me that obviously something's gained by these, they feel that something's gained by them being, the men by being mischaracterized.
Mhm.
Would women experience this in the same way? And why might that be very different? I assume that it seems like it would be a less likely narrative for women to say, everyone thinks I'm a lesbian. Isn't that funny? And you said, yes, everyone thinks I'm a lesbian too. I can't imagine it playing out the same way. So can you unpack that? And then can you just say 2 sentences about the men who can parent too? That was another group of yours, and it was an anti-feminist group. And I guess I just feel like if men can parent too, that doesn't sound so anti-feminist. So can you just say like 2 sentences about what that group was?
Sure. Well, first, I can't imagine a group of women doing something similar either, and for a couple of reasons. One, for the demographers in the room, lesbian is like a category that's being erased right now. That it's sort of interesting. Like, there's a lot of sort of demographic questions about like, where are the lesbians going? They're like migrating to other identities and things, but it's also interactionally, I just think it's a masculine interactional practice. And so if you take out the kind of content of what they're bragging about and you just listen to the interaction and put in almost anything else, knowledge of football, I'm more successful at work than you, whatever, it actually sounds like a very traditional masculine interactional style. And that's why I think I can't imagine it among a group of women, at least not in exactly the same way, right? And men can parent too. So I studied, that's a father's rights organization, and they're both an activist group, and it's like men who are undergoing marital dissolution and child custody proceedings and things like that. And I studied them because of what you just brought up. I wanted to study the men's rights movement, but already at that point in my career, they did not want to have me in the room. But the father's rights movement is a piece of the men's rights movement. And when I studied that group, I was actually interested in them precisely because of their kind of like, politically, they're kind of nebulous. Like, they're probably the most successful arm of the men's rights movement because they have this discourse that initially feminists are like, yeah, we want, sure, dads to show up and help and stuff. And they're like, yeah, that's what we want, right? But there are these other elements that, so I found that like really interesting. Like, this is anti-feminism that's mainstream, anti-feminism that kind of everybody feels a little bit comfortable with. And if you compare them to like some of the uglier arms of the men's rights movement that most people don't have trouble recognizing as detestable, these are men that I think you could understand. I get it. I get what sucked you in. I sort of can understand your politics, and yeah. Thanks.
Are there any Zoom questions I just wanted before?
There is. Just read it off.
That's fine.
Okay,
Who's it from?
your name is Miss X.
Terrifying.
Is it
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
No, it's
Hey.
Maybe it's Elon Musk. They're asking, what do you find in your studies that is functioning as the fundamental anchor point for these men to consider them still as masculine? And what would you say is the foundation that constructs their masculine identities for their manhood that in its hybrid form keeps their roots in a masculine position, while on the other hand showing the masculine culture?
Uh-huh. That's a great question. I think for this group, it's actually, it's like this shared group setting. I met tons of group, and I still meet tons of men in feminist group settings who are like, I've never had men friends before. But here's this group of 22 men that get together every weekend and like make snacks for each other. And they kind of make it cool to get into gender and talk about how they had a hard time in elementary school. And so I think the sort of masculinizing aspect of it is that it's this homosocial space that many of them have kind of never found themselves in before, even if they wanted to. Yeah. I don't know why I answered you. I know you didn't ask.
I was just wondering about like the contributions of these particular groups in feminist spaces, because you mentioned that they had like a hand in like workshops with like young boys and like middle school, as well as like other men potentially. So like, I also was wondering like, what are their credentials for holding such workshops and stuff?
Ooh, I have a graduate student who's studying credentials. I mean, you know, this is part of why they're so eager to like use mistaken for gay stories as evidence of their like authenticity of their political claims, because it's not like at some point, sorry for the men in the room, there's no point at which they hand you a feminist card and are like, congratulations, show this to people when you show up at a club. So the credentialing of it is kind of an on the spot sort of a thing. So a lot of what they do is kind of, I think we would call consciousness raising. Like a lot of what they do at the weekly meetings is just kind of collectively process and counsel one another to think about what it might look like to lead a feminist life. But then they also showed up to events. So they showed up to pro-choice rallies. They showed up and helped with the Walk a Mile in Her Shoes march every year in their community. And they helped out in various spaces like that. And usually it was like one member would connect with someone from an organization that's helping with some other feminist cause and ask, what can we do? Where do you need us? Kind of thing. And so they did a lot of that sort of work. So it was always just a sort of one-off. They didn't like connect their group more formally with one of those organizations though. And they liked those opportunities because they got to come back. The weekend meeting after we participated in something like that was always lively, in part because they were like, oh my gosh, we just like last week we did feminism together. Did you feel it? I still feel electric. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always fun. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.